The escape pod's warning systems screamed as Commander Sarah Chen fought to control its descent through Nexus 7's turbulent atmosphere. The planet's twin suns cast an eerie purple glow through the thick clouds, illuminating the jagged landscape rushing up to meet her. Her exploration vessel, the ESS Horizon, was now nothing more than debris scattered across the system after an unexpected asteroid storm had torn through its hull. Come on, Sarah muttered, her fingers dancing across the pod's failing control panel. The gravitational readings made no sense, they fluctuated wildly, defying every known law of physics she'd studied during her decade with the Earth Space Corps. The pod shuddered violently as another gravity wave hit, threatening to tear it apart. The impact came faster than she expected. The pod skipped across the surface like a stone across water, each bounce sending shockwaves through her body despite the inertial dampeners. When it finally came to rest, Sarah found herself hanging upside down, held in place by her harness, listening to the dying whine of the pod systems. She took stock of her situation as she freed herself from the restraints. The emergency beacon was transmitting, but on this frontier world, it could be weeks or even months before anyone picked up the signal. Her survival kit was intact: water purifier, nutrient packs, medical supplies, and basic tools. It would have to be enough. The pod's door groaned as Sarah forced it open, and she got her first real look at Nexus 7. The landscape before her seemed to defy reality itself. Massive floating rocks hung suspended in the air, defying gravity. The ground was a maze of crystalline formations that pulsed with an inner light, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with strange distortions. But it was the silence that struck her first, an absolute, pressing silence that made her ears ring. Then she saw it, and her breath caught in her throat. A creature emerged from behind one of the floating rocks, and Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It moved like liquid shadow, its form constantly shifting and flowing, yet maintaining a vaguely serpentine shape. It was massive, easily the length of 3 transport ships, with what appeared to be clusters of crystalline formations growing from its body. As it moved, the floating rocks around it shifted in response, as if the creature was manipulating gravity itself. Sarah's first instinct was to reach for her pulse pistol, but she stopped herself. 10 years of xenobiological training kicked in, and she forced herself to remain still and observe. The creature, she would later name them Void Walkers, hadn't attacked immediately, which meant it was either assessing her or simply curious. More of them appeared, emerging from what seemed to be thin air, each one unique in its patterns of crystalline growths. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible for their size, weaving between the floating rocks in what almost looked like a dance. Sarah noticed that the gravitational distortions she detected during her descent seemed to emanate from these beings. Fascinating, she whispered, pulling out her datapad to begin recording. The creatures responded to the sound of her voice, their crystalline formations pulsing with soft light. The rocks around them shifted in complex patterns, and Sarah's datapad registered corresponding gravitational fluctuations. "You're communicating, aren't you?" she realized, watching the patterns repeat. Using gravity itself as a language. It was unprecedented, a species that had evolved to manipulate one of the fundamental forces of the universe. The largest of the Void Walkers, a behemoth with deep purple crystalline formations, approached her position. Sarah stood her ground, heart pounding but mind racing with possibilities. If these creatures were intelligent enough to communicate, they might be the key to her survival on this world, and perhaps something far more important. As the massive being drew closer, Sarah made a decision that would change not only her fate but the future of human-alien relations. She deactivated her datapad, set it down, and stepped forward with open hands. The universal gesture of peace might mean nothing to these creatures, but the intent behind it, vulnerability freely offered, transcended species. The Void Walker stopped its approach, hanging motionless in the air before her. Then, slowly, the crystals along its body began to pulse in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The floating rocks around them settled gently to the ground, and Sarah felt the oppressive gravity ease. "Well," she said, a smile spreading across her face despite her situation. I guess this is first contact. She had no way of knowing then that this moment would be remembered as the beginning of one of humanity's most remarkable partnerships with an alien species. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the crystalline landscape. Sarah began setting up her emergency shelter, all too aware of the massive beings watching her every move. She had survived the crash, but her real challenge was just beginning. On this alien world, with these extraordinary creatures, she would need to rewrite everything she thought she knew about life in the universe. As darkness fell, the Voidwalker's crystals began to glow, creating a breathtaking display of light that danced across the landscape. Sarah sat at the entrance of her shelter, datapad in hand, and began her first log entry, Day 1 on Nexus 7. I've discovered something impossible here, something that changes everything. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning. By the third day on Nexus 7, Sarah Chen had established a routine. Each morning, she ventured further from her crash site, mapping the terrain and studying the Voidwalkers. The massive being she'd named Atlas, the one with deep purple crystals, had become a constant presence, following her expeditions from a distance that grew shorter with each passing day. The breakthrough came during one of her gravity field measurements. Sarah had noticed that the Voidwalkers' gravitational communications created distinct patterns, not random fluctuations, but precise, repeatable sequences. She sat cross-legged on a crystalline outcropping, surrounded by her instruments, when Atlas approached closer than ever before. "You're curious about these, aren't you?" Sarah spoke softly, holding up one of her sensors. The creature's crystalline formations pulsed in response, and she felt the familiar shift in gravity, but this time, she was ready for it. Her instruments captured every nuance of the gravitational wave. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity, like a symphony written in the language of physics itself. Sarah began to notice that certain sequences repeated when specific events occurred. A sharp spike followed by 3 gentle waves seemed to signal danger. A rolling pattern of fluctuations appeared during their feeding times, when the Voidwalkers absorbed energy directly from the crystalline formations that dotted the landscape. "You're not just communicating," Sarah realized, reviewing her data. "You're sharing memories, emotions, experiences, all encoded in gravitational waves." She looked up at Atlas, whose massive form now hovered just meters away. "Your entire species is connected through the fundamental forces of the universe itself." Her fascination must have shown in her expression, because Atlas moved closer still. The other Voidwalkers had gathered as well, their crystalline formations glowing in harmony. Sarah felt the gravity around her shift, but not in the usual ways. It was gentler, almost like a caress. She reached for her tablet and pulled up the gravitational wave patterns she'd recorded. With careful adjustments to her equipment, she played one back, a simple sequence she'd observed during peaceful gatherings of the Voidwalkers. The effect was immediate. Every crystal on Atlas's body lit up, and the gravity around them danced in response. "You understood that, didn't you?" Sarah laughed, her excitement overwhelming her scientific detachment. She played another sequence, and another. Each time, the Voidwalkers responded with their own patterns, more complex but building on what she had shared. But it wasn't until sunset that Sarah witnessed something truly extraordinary. As the twin suns dipped below the horizon, Atlas positioned himself between her camp and a massive approaching storm system. The other Voidwalkers joined him, forming a living barrier. The gravity waves they generated created a protective field that deflected the worst of the storm's fury. "You're protecting me," Sarah whispered, watching in awe as lightning crashed harmlessly against the gravitational shield. "Even though you barely know me, you're keeping me safe." The realization brought tears to her eyes, not from fear or relief, but from the pure beauty of the moment. Here, light years from Earth, she had found not just aliens, but allies. That night, Sarah worked by the light of her emergency lamps, modifying her equipment. If the Voidwalkers could manipulate gravity with such precision, perhaps she could create a device to do the same, not with their level of control, but enough to establish basic communication. "I need to understand you better," she said to Atlas, who remained nearby, crystals glowing softly in the darkness. "There's so much we could learn from each other." She held up her tablet, displaying the waveforms she'd recorded. "See these patterns? They're beautiful. Like music written in the language of physics. I think if I can decode them, really understand them, we might be able to share so much more." The Voidwalker's response was unexpected. Atlas moved to hover directly over her camp, and one by one, its crystals began to pulse in a new pattern, one she had never recorded before. The gravity waves it generated were complex but strangely familiar. With a start, Sarah realized they matched the rhythm of human speech. "You've been studying me too, haven't you?" she laughed, shaking her head in amazement. "All this time I've been taking notes about you, you've been learning about me." She pointed to her throat, then to her tablet. "Sound waves and gravity waves, different languages for the same things. Thoughts, feelings, warnings, greetings." Atlas's crystals pulsed in what Sarah had come to recognize as agreement. The creature moved lower, close enough that she could see the intricate patterns within each crystal formation. They weren't just random growths, they were organs, sensory arrays capable of detecting and manipulating gravitational fields with incredible precision. As she made notes on her observations, Sarah felt a shift in the air, something beyond the usual gravitational fluctuations. Looking up, she saw that the other Voidwalkers had gathered in a circle around her camp. Their crystals were pulsing in unison, creating a pattern more complex than any she had recorded before. "What are you trying to tell me?" she wondered aloud, scrambling to adjust her sensors. But as the pattern continued, she began to notice something wrong. The Voidwalkers' movements seemed labored, their crystalline formations dulled. Even Atlas, magnificent and powerful, showed signs of strain. Sarah's scientific excitement gave way to concern. These beings, for all their incredible abilities, were struggling with something. The question was, what could possibly threaten creatures capable of manipulating gravity itself? The answer, she would soon discover, would test not only her understanding of the Voidwalkers but her own limits as well. Sarah spent the next week salvaging components from her crashed escape pod, working through the planet's long nights to build something unprecedented, a gravity wave synthesizer. Her hands were covered in cuts and burns from repurposing the pod's artificial gravity generators, but she barely noticed the pain. Time was running out. The Voidwalkers were dying. She had confirmed it through her measurements, the crystalline formations that gave them their remarkable abilities were degrading. Each day, their gravitational signals grew weaker, their movements more labored. Even Atlas, who still maintained his protective vigil over her camp, showed signs of deterioration. "Just a few more adjustments," Sarah muttered, soldering the final connections on her device. She had cannibalized her emergency beacon to power it, a risky choice that could cost her any chance of rescue, but she couldn't stand by and watch these extraordinary beings fade away. The synthesizer was crude compared to the Voidwalker's natural abilities, but it might be enough to establish clear communication. As she worked, she went over her observations. The degradation had started in the crystals furthest from the core of each Voidwalker's body. At first, she thought it might be a disease, but her scans revealed something far more troubling. The crystalline structures weren't just organs, they were part of a complex system that maintained the delicate gravitational balance of the entire planet. "Your ancestors evolved to become part of this world's fundamental forces," she said to Atlas, who watched her work with unwavering attention. "But something's changed, hasn't it? Something in the environment that's disrupting the balance you maintain." The Voidwalker's crystals pulsed weakly in response, and Sarah felt the familiar gentle shift in gravity that she had come to recognize as confirmation. She checked her atmospheric readings again, there it was. Subtle changes in the planet's magnetic field were creating interference patterns in the gravimetric waves the Voidwalkers used to communicate and feed. Finally, Sarah's device was ready. She placed it on the ground and activated it, holding her breath as it powered up. The generator hummed to life, and she input the first sequence, the simple greeting pattern she had recorded during her early observations. The effect was immediate. Every Voidwalker in the vicinity turned toward the device, their crystals lighting up with renewed energy. Atlas moved closer, hovering directly above the synthesizer. Sarah felt the gravity around her shift in complex ways as the creature responded to her artificial signal. With trembling fingers, she adjusted the controls, modulating the gravitational frequency to match the patterns she had recorded during her studies. It wasn't perfect, the waves were rougher, less nuanced than the Voidwalker's natural communications, but it was enough. "My name is Sarah," she said, simultaneously transmitting a gravity pulse pattern she had associated with self-identification. "I want to help you." Atlas's response came as a series of gravitational pulses that her sensors translated into data. Through the crude interface of her device, Sarah began to understand. The Voidwalkers were more than just inhabitants of this world, they were its caretakers. For millions of years, they had maintained the delicate balance of gravitational forces that kept the planet stable. But now that balance was failing. Changes in the planet's core were creating gravitational anomalies that the Voidwalkers couldn't compensate for. Their attempts to maintain stability were draining their energy, causing the crystalline degradation that threatened their existence. "That's why you protected me," Sarah realized, looking up at Atlas. "You recognized that I might understand what was happening. That I might find a way to help." She felt a gentle gravitational embrace, the closest thing to a yes in their emerging shared language. Sarah turned to her data tablets, pulling up everything she had recorded about the planet's geological and gravitational patterns. There had to be a solution. The Voidwalkers had evolved alongside these natural forces, they weren't meant to fight them, but to work with them. As she studied the data, a pattern began to emerge. The gravitational anomalies weren't random, they followed a cycle, like tides responding to the pull of the twin suns. The Voidwalkers were expending enormous energy fighting these cycles when they should have been. "You need to adapt," Sarah exclaimed, quickly adjusting her synthesizer to transmit her insight. "The planet isn't dying, it's changing. Evolution didn't stop with your ancestors. The changes in the core, they're not a threat, they're an opportunity." Through her device, she showed them what she had discovered. The gravitational fluctuations could actually amplify their abilities if they learned to work with them rather than against them. But to do that, they would need to modify their crystalline structures, a dangerous and difficult process that would require perfect timing. Atlas's response was immediate and clear. The massive Voidwalker generated a gravity wave so complex that Sarah's sensors could barely track it. But she understood the meaning, they were willing to try. They trusted her. The realization hit her hard. These ancient, powerful beings were putting their fate in her hands. The gravity wave synthesizer hummed as Sarah began transmitting detailed instructions, knowing that what came next would either save the Voidwalkers or doom them completely. As the twin suns set on another day on Nexus 7, Sarah looked at her dwindling supplies and the salvaged parts of her emergency beacon. She had committed everything she had to this plan. Now all she could do was hope it would be enough. The real test would come with the next gravitational surge, and according to her calculations, that was less than 24 hours away. The gravitational storm arrived exactly when Sarah's calculations predicted. The twin suns disappeared behind roiling clouds that twisted in impossible ways as space itself seemed to buckle. The floating rocks that dotted the landscape began to vibrate, resonating with frequencies that made Sarah's teeth ache. Her gravity wave synthesizer was working overtime, transmitting the complex patterns that would help the Voidwalkers synchronize their transformation with the storm's peak. She had explained the process as best she could, they needed to use the storm's energy to catalyze changes in their crystalline structures, adapting them to the planet's new gravitational patterns. "Ready?" she asked Atlas, who hovered protectively near her camp. The massive creature's crystals pulsed in response, dimmer than ever but still determined. Around them, Dozens of other Voidwalkers had gathered, forming a massive circle that stretched across the crystalline plane. Sarah checked her instruments one last time. The gravitational waves were intensifying, building toward a crescendo that would either save or destroy the Voidwalkers. She had staked everything on her understanding of their biology and the planet's changing dynamics. If she was wrong. The first shock wave hit like a physical blow. Sarah stumbled, catching herself on her makeshift equipment array. The Voidwalkers began to move, their massive forms flowing like liquid shadow as they positioned themselves according to her calculations. Atlas remained at the center, acting as an anchor point for the others. "Begin the resonance sequence," Sarah transmitted through her synthesizer. The device groaned under the strain, its salvaged components barely holding together. Around her, the Voidwalker's crystals began to pulse in unison, creating interference patterns in the gravitational field. The storm intensified. Rocks the size of buildings were torn from the ground, spinning in complex orbits around the Voidwalkers. Sarah's hair stood on end as electromagnetic forces built up in the atmosphere. Her instruments were registering gravitational forces that should have been impossible on a planet this size. Then something went wrong. One of the Voidwalkers in the outer circle faltered, its crystals flickering erratically. The carefully constructed resonance pattern began to break down. Sarah watched in horror as the gravitational forces they had been trying to harness started to tear at the creature's crystalline structures. No, no, no. She frantically adjusted her synthesizer, trying to compensate for the breakdown. But the device wasn't powerful enough to maintain the pattern alone. The Voidwalkers were being pulled apart by the very forces they had evolved to control. Atlas suddenly moved, positioning himself between Sarah and the chaos. His massive form shuddered under the gravitational onslaught, but he held firm. Through their crude communication system, Sarah felt rather than heard his message. There was still a chance, but it would require something drastic. Sarah understood. She looked at her gravity wave synthesizer, then at the failing pattern of Voidwalkers around her. The answer was there, but the cost would be enormous. She made her decision in an instant. "Trust me," she transmitted to Atlas, then began to dismantle her device. Working with desperate speed, she rerouted power from its safeguards directly into the wave generation matrix. The synthesizer's hum rose to a dangerous whine as she pushed it far beyond its design limits. "Everyone, realign with Atlas," she transmitted, even as her device began to spark and smoke. "Use his pattern as your anchor. Let the storm in, don't fight it." The Voidwalkers responded, their massive forms shifting to mirror Atlas's position. Sarah input the final sequence, knowing it would destroy her only means of communication with these extraordinary beings. The synthesizer exploded in a cascade of sparks and gravitational distortions, but not before transmitting its last signal. The pulse it generated was perfectly tuned to the storm's resonance frequency, amplified by the Voidwalker's own crystalline structures. For a moment, reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Then it happened. The Voidwalker's crystals began to change, not degrading but transforming. New patterns emerged within their structures, adapting to the planet's altered gravitational field. The storm's energy, instead of tearing them apart, was being channeled into their evolution. Sarah watched in awe as Atlas's form shifted and flowed, his crystals taking on new configurations that glowed with internal light. The other Voidwalkers followed, their massive bodies moving in perfect synchronization as they completed their transformation. The storm began to dissipate, its energy spent. As the twin suns broke through the clouds, Sarah saw the results of their desperate gamble. The Voidwalkers were changed but alive, their new crystalline structures pulsing with renewed strength. They had adapted, becoming one with the planet's new gravitational patterns. But the victory had come at a price. Sarah's gravity wave synthesizer was destroyed, along with any hope of maintaining the complex communication she had established with these beings. She looked up at Atlas, whose new form was both familiar and startlingly different, and wondered if they would still be able to understand each other. The answer came in a gentle gravitational embrace that needed no translation. The Void Walkers had survived, evolved, and their gratitude transcended any need for words. As Sarah stood among the floating crystals and transformed beings, she realized that sometimes the strongest connections didn't need technology to bridge them, they just needed trust. 3 months after the gravitational storm, Sarah Chen sat at the entrance of her now permanent shelter, recording what she expected to be her final log entry. Her emergency supplies had run out weeks ago, but the Void Walkers had shown her how to harvest energy from the crystalline formations that dotted the landscape, just as they did. It wasn't quite the same as real food, but it kept her alive. The planet had changed since the storm. The Void Walkers' transformation had altered more than just their own bodies, their connection to Nexus 7's fundamental forces had evolved as well. The floating rocks now moved in new patterns, and the crystalline growths pulsed with stronger, more stable energy. It was as if the entire world had shifted into a higher state of harmony. "They're teaching me," Sarah spoke into her tablet's recorder, watching Atlas demonstrate a complex gravitational manipulation. Without her synthesizer, their communication had returned to basics, but something deeper had replaced it. She had begun to sense the gravitational fields naturally, her human brain adapting in ways she never thought possible. "I think this is what they wanted all along," she continued. "Not just to survive, but to evolve. To show that different species, different forms of life, can find ways to understand each other beyond technology or traditional language." Atlas hovered nearby, his new crystalline structure catching the light of the twin suns. The transformation had made him even more magnificent. His once solid crystals now seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, folding space around them in ways that Sarah's scientific training still struggled to explain. She was about to make another note when a new gravitational pattern caught her attention. The Void Walkers had suddenly aligned themselves, their crystals pulsing in a familiar warning sequence. Sarah felt it too, something was entering the atmosphere. Looking up, she saw a flash of metal against the purple sky. Her heart leaped as she recognized the design, an Earth Space Corps rescue vessel. After all these months, they had finally detected the remnants of her emergency beacon signal. But as the ship descended, Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance. She had dreamed of rescue for so long, yet now. She looked at Atlas, at the community of Void Walkers that had accepted her, taught her, trusted her. They had shown her something beyond human understanding, offered her a glimpse of what was possible when different forms of life chose to cooperate rather than compete. The rescue ship landed a kilometer from her position, stirring up clouds of crystalline dust. Sarah watched as a team in ESC uniforms emerged, their scanners sweeping the area. She knew what they were seeing, readings that would revolutionize their understanding of physics, biology, and the very nature of life itself. Atlas moved closer, generating a gentle gravitational field that she had come to recognize as a question. Sarah smiled, placing her hand near his transformed crystals. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm not leaving. There's too much still to learn here, too much we can teach each other." When the rescue team reached her position, they froze at the sight of the massive Void Walkers. Sarah stepped forward, standing between her human colleagues and her alien friends. "Welcome to Nexus 7, she said calmly. "I have one condition before you come any closer. This isn't a place for weapons or fear. What we've discovered here changes everything we thought we knew about life in the universe. And I'm going to make sure we do this right." The team leader slowly lowered his weapon, eyes wide with wonder as Atlas performed a complex gravitational dance that set the crystalline formations glowing. Sarah felt a surge of pride and hope. This was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Nexus 7 became the site of humanity's first true xenoscientific cooperation. Sarah's decision to stay became the foundation for a new kind of relationship between species. The Void Walkers shared their understanding of gravitational forces, while humans offered their technological insights and connection to the wider galaxy. More importantly, they proved that trust and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps between species. The Voidwalker's evolution hadn't just been physical, it had opened a door to possibilities that neither humanity nor the Voidwalkers had imagined alone. Sarah's final log entry, transmitted across the galaxy and studied by generations of xenoscientists, ended with words that would become famous throughout human space: the universe isn't divided between predator and prey, between strong and weak. It's connected by forces we're only beginning to understand. And sometimes, the greatest discoveries come not from conquering or controlling those forces, but from learning to trust them, to move with them, to evolve alongside them. That's the real legacy of Nexus 7, not what we found here, but what we became together. Atlas's crystals pulsed in agreement, sending ripples through the gravitational field that Sarah now felt as clearly as her own heartbeat. Around them, the transformed landscape of Nexus 7 shimmered with possibility, a testament to what could be achieved when different forms of life chose to reach across the void and trust in something greater than themselves.